Welcome to our panel discussion on working with external partners in civic engagement work. I'm joined today by two panelists with experience forming lasting partnerships and working with external organizations. On the panel today, we have Jennifer Jackman, Professor of Politics, Policy, and International Relations at Salem State University, and Matt Lamb, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Texas Tech University. I'm William Obrochta, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Texas Lutheran University and Director of Professional Development for the APSA Civic Engagement section. The goal of today's panel is really to focus on the origin of some of the projects that our panelists work on with external partners, and to think about how those projects developed, why those projects are important for the partners and for the students, as well as the faculty that are involved. So both of our panelists today have wide-ranging experiences putting on partnerships with students and with community organizations. And I just wanted to kind of start off thinking about a bit about how you initially got involved in these kinds of partnerships, and wondered if you could just give us a little bit of background to help us understand how the partnerships formed and what your interests were in them. So Matt, I wondered if you could start us off with just a little background about your origin story working with partners.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. My origin story, I guess, whether it's a hero origin story or villain origin story, depends on a matter of perspective. But the way I got started doing this work was as a graduate student, studying at Rice under Bob Stein. As much as I would love to say that this was out of some noble endeavor and notions of working with communities and all that, it was largely me looking for some extra income as a graduate student. I decided to seek out working with the Rice Center for Civic Leadership. And they had a program that was called the HART program, Houston Action Research Teams, which was devoted to doing recruiting graduate and undergraduate student research teams that would essentially do a project, a capstone, or undertake some sort of research endeavor for a local community partner. And so that's where I first started working, uh, doing research with community partners and involving students in that sort of research. And many of the, several of the community partners that I worked with in that position, I then went on to later work with for several research projects and doing research independently on other projects. But while doing that, essentially what I learned is how to initiate research projects that would involve undergraduate students and involve students in research, and ways you can actually treat research as both, not just a research in the pursuit of another publication or another project, but as a learning opportunity for undergraduate students. And the reason why I thought that it was so useful to do this kind of work was because doing these kinds of projects with students and using them as learning opportunities serves several ends. One, it served my own research agenda. Two, it served as a learning experience for the students, not just in academic research methods in case the students wanted to go on and do academia, but it also got them in touch with more practical community-based organizations, and got them that practical experience should they decide to go on the non-academic job market later on. So the rest is history. That I just started sort of taking that philosophy and working with community partners, and I work a lot with the election administrator office here in Lubbock. Um, so that's how I got my start and why I'm pursuing the type of research I do now.
Jennifer, what about your origin story? I think many probably similar themes to what Matt has discussed.
Yeah, so thank you for including me in this discussion. My origin story is actually different trajectory. I had sort of prior career, about 20 years before I shifted to academia, where I was working with advocacy organizations, in advocacy organizations within the feminist movement, with the National Organization for Women, with the Feminist Majority. I also worked with the Humane Society of the United States. So, in those various capacities, especially within the feminist movement, we always had student interns. So, working with students on advocacy and on research from within organizations has always been sort of a part of my DNA. I shifted in over to academia in 2008, and that joined the faculty of Salem State University. And that coincided with the start of a new president of the university for whom civic engagement was a priority. And so, and sort of that resulted in more engagement of and a concerted effort of the university to involve faculty in civic engagement to bring together community partners. And so I became involved in that since it was a natural extension of my prior advocacy work. And it was sort of through that effort that I met one of my first partnerships with the North Shore Community Development Coalition. They were looking for someone to work on voting rights projects. Voting rights was something that was important to me and of interest to me. And that really forged the first relationship to do a combination work with several organizations on voter registration and on voter mobilization for a year-long project that was based in several of my classes and classes of my colleagues.
So I think the combination kind of both of y'all's responses has to do with some prior experience, whether it be it in grad school or working with nonprofit organizations already, and then kind of seizing an opportunity. Jennifer, you mentioned, you were working at Salem State and there was a new emphasis on civically engaged work, or Matt, you were talking about that, you were working as a grad student and fell into this opportunity and then saw the potential ways to tie research together with working with students, et cetera. So I wonder if you could describe, you've mentioned a couple examples of some partnerships, but I wondered if you could describe some of those partnerships you've worked on, and particularly what the goals were that you considered when you were thinking about working in that partnership. Were those goals mostly for yourself in terms of research interests, or were they really a combination between, as Jennifer was talking about, the actual mobilization, the outcome in the community, or were they student goals, or what the goals were overall? Matt, I wondered if you could start talking about, an example of a partnership and then some of the goals and objectives from it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and it's interesting you use the term goals. Now, the partnerships I've worked with in terms of community partners, um, you start to sort of notice where there are differences in goals and specifically timelines, right? So for at least in my experience, most of the community partners I worked with, in terms of the projects that they wanted to accomplish, a lot of non-academic organizations, whether it be nonprofits, NGOs, things like that, they have goals that they really, really need or want to accomplish in the short term. Oh, this has to be done, by the end of spring. This has to be done within the next few months. Whereas academics tend to have more long-term goals in terms of, oh, we need to get this project done over the next year, over the next couple of years, et cetera. And so what my approach has often been is, okay, sort of use the short-term project as a launching pad for a longer-term project with the community partners' permission, of course. So some of the recent partnerships that I've worked with, for example, most recently with the Lubbock County Election Administrator's Office, where they were very interested in surveying their poll workers to see what their concerns were, to see how they approached their jobs as being election workers, and to see if they were in any way concerned about, for example, the rhetoric regarding elections in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Then I often involve student researchers in that project. and that is going towards sort of my longer term research agenda of gathering data on poll worker attitudes. Another example is that I've worked frequently with a organization called Mi Familia Vota, which is a Latino issues oriented voter mobilization and advocacy organization. And so I've worked with them on quite a few projects, primarily with their youth civic engagement conference in the summer. And so what they're very interested in is uh, measuring the effectiveness of their civic education programs, what is motivating their students. And so I've designed a few projects working with some of my student assistants and all that, measuring the effects of civic engagement programs on their youth uh, programs. So those are a couple of the bigger examples I can think of in terms of community partners that I've worked with, and uh, sort of illustrating how those goals can sometimes differ, especially in terms of the timeline that you're working with. But if you're careful about it, you can. There's no reason you have to choose one goal or the other, right? So those are the two biggest examples I can think of in terms of my experiences.
Jennifer?
Yeah, so for mine, I'll talk first about the project that I mentioned, the voter registration and mobilization project, and then a more recent project around seals and sharks. For the project, the voter registration and mobilization project, the goals of the organization were to increase the registration of voters. This project took place in the Point neighborhood, which is just down the road from Salem State University, but it's a very underserved, largely immigrant community that has been neglected by this in the past by the city of Salem in terms of providing both resources, but also providing a polling place. The city had moved a polling place away from this neighborhood. And so one of the major goals of the project was to increase voter registration, increase voter mobilization, and get the polling place back to get into the precinct that serves the neighborhood. And so that was the goals. That was the primary goal of the organization, and it's a goal that I shared. In terms of my students, my main goal was to increase their political engagement, to increase their sort of democratic thinking. And I've always believed, having come from an advocacy background, that working with organizations and with activists is the best way for students to learn how to become politically engaged and really value collective action, and also to just get to know the community better. So those were my goals, and so they were compatible. We did, there are the time differences because we do operate on a semester framework. In the first two classes I was combining were also online classes, so that made it even a little more challenging to get students to actually come in person when they signed up for an online class, but it ended up working fine. The second class, then we were not involved during the summer, but we were involved for the voter mobilization phase in the fall with a different class. The other project is my primary research for the last 10 years has been in the field of human dimensions of wildlife, looking at attitudes towards wildlife among different groups. And my initial research was on attitudes towards coyotes. I tend to focus on those species that are sort of persecuted by the public in order to get more data to see what public attitudes are like and whether they shift, and also to get data from different constituencies. And so my data on coyotes had shown that there was more support for coyotes than was being recognized in the media. And then I did a longitudinal study and found that acceptance of coyotes grew over time. I was then approached when I was presenting the coyote research on Cape Cod by two organizations, the North Atlantic Seal Research Consortium and the Marine Mammal Conservation Organization, operating on Cape Cod and Nantucket. And they asked me to, could I apply my skills and do the same kind of research on seals that were becoming very more controversial, and people were sort of attacking them both physically as well as politically. And could there be some research that was done on that? And so we decided to do a multi-stakeholder approach where we did research on attitudes of voters, of tourists, and of fishing participants, recreational anglers in one study, commercial fishermen in another, to bring multiple voices and to get some real data that we could use. And I'm not going to go belabor it very much longer, but it ended up being a partnership that has lasted for 10 years, and most recently a partnership gaining new members. I was working with the Northwest Atlantic Sea Research Consortium, Center for Coastal Studies, Atlantic White Shark Conservancy, and also the Cape Cod Commercial Fisheries Alliance. So wide range of stakeholders on a project that involved a lot of students over the years in research assistant capacities. It also involves some other universities. Our department is an undergraduate department. But we also brought in the University of Massachusetts and Tufts University. So we had some graduate students that were working with the undergraduate students. And so it ended up being a very fruitful experience. And so the goals of these partners were to get more data on what public attitudes and these different stakeholder attitudes were, in order to help with messaging, in order to help with communications with each other, to better understand the different constituencies, as well as to be able to contribute to management dialogues around these different species.
Thanks. So one thing that came up in both of your responses was kind of the different, not only goals of the partners, but the structures of the partners and the partnerships. So Matt was mentioning some government organizations as partners. Jennifer, you were mentioning advocacy organizations, and Matt, you were as well. And then at the end, Jennifer, you were talking about kind of a combination of perhaps all different sides of the seals and sharks, just kind of with the fishermen and other organizations in there as well. I wondered if y'all could say something about selection of partnership groups, or if you intended to focus on just governmental or non-governmental partners, or if you kind of fell into the idea of working with multiple partners at once, kind of as Jennifer you were last describing. Do those government versus non-governmental partnerships make any difference in the way you're thinking about the partnership and how it might work? Or is it just what's the best fit for the given project and those circumstances? Matt, what do you think about this question?
The answer to that question is yes. So I've worked with a few community partners, and a lot of times what has happened, at least in my experience, is that a community partner, whether it be a nonprofit, a government agency, usually a municipal level government agency, has a project or a policy issue dilemma that they wish to be researched, and they are looking for some sort of outside entity to research it in order to sort of give legitimacy to whatever the findings are. And a lot of times the local university they feel is the best place to do that, right? And so oftentimes what I've experienced is that these organizations will come to the university trying to find people, whether it be faculty, departments, centers to work with. Um, um, but whenever we are determining whether or not to work with them, or at least in my experience, I and other people that I was working with usually considered a few things. One, um, is this going to be something where students can actually be involved and in a productive way? Because not all projects lend themselves to learning opportunities like that. Two, is the community partner looking for a certain results, right? That might, impact how we do things. And, is that really something that we want to get involved with? Um, and of course, three, what kind of timeline are they looking at? Do they want the project to be done in a time frame that's feasible for us to actually get it done? So whenever we're looking at community partners, um, sometimes, yes, they will come to us, but we have to make the decision on whether or not to work with them. So that's sort of my thinking and some of my colleagues' thinking on whether or not to work with community partners. Now, I've also a couple of times solicited uh, partnerships with other organizations because they fit a particular project that I was working on. And your approach has to be a bit different because, unlike organizations that solicit uh, the input of universities or academics because they feel like it legitimizes whatever project they're trying to conduct. If you go to agencies that have not yet solicited help or support from academic institutions, you have to remember there might be a reason why that is. And so I've had experiences where I've approached community partnerships, and their response was essentially, well, we don't know about getting involved in a university because we have several constituencies, stakeholders that are skeptical of institutions of higher education, and we don't necessarily want to, cause issues with that. And so you have to, if it is something that you really, really need this particular partner to accomplish some academic project, you just have to really have an argument for why the partnership will be beneficial to the community partner as well, right? Um, so that's something that you have to consider is that you probably already have your reasons why you want to work with that, and namely all the criteria that I just said in the first part of uh, this segment. But you have to make sure that whatever argument that you put forth in order to convince a community partner to work with you, that you have to make sure that this is that you actually have put into thought into why the partnership will be beneficial to them as well, right? So, yeah.
Jennifer, your thoughts on different types of partners?
Yeah, so similar to what Matt said, the projects that I've been involved with are ones that where the idea and the goal and the problem to be solved really emerged from the community partner. Um, and it's the same kind of sort of evaluation of, do I have the skills? Do I have, the interest? Will the students be interested in the project? And is it possible on a time scale? I think in the case, so my colleagues, we have another sort of whole project, the North Shore Policy Lab, that the university is just setting up, that our department is just setting up, that is, working with community organizations in an ongoing way on a series of projects. But one of the things that is, in my experience, has been to just follow the lead of the community organization. So, for example, on the seal and shark study, I was first approached by the Northwest Atlantic Seal Research Consortium, worked with them on designing a pilot study. They then approached me about the larger scales project of doing a seal and shark study, and they were the ones who recruited the other partners to be a part of it. So I started working with West Atlantic Seal Research Consortium. They brought in Center for Coastal Studies. They brought in the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy, and then felt that it was important for the credibility of the study to involve the Cape Cod Commercial Fishers Alliance. So it was really this organization's relationships with these other organizations and identification of the need for that collaboration for the overall project that brought everybody together. And I was the principal investigator for it, but I was not the one that forged all of the partnerships. And I think that partnership was very, very critical. And so we played a role of of coordination and of the directing the research study, but it was very much, led by those organizations.
So we've talked a little bit about involving students in the partnerships and developing those partnerships with different organizations such that students will have the opportunity. Matt, I think you laid that out as a criteria for you. What level could the students engage in the partnership? And Jennifer, you were talking about different types of students and levels of students, undergraduate versus graduate students, and what their involvement might be. I wondered if we could talk a little bit about classes versus kind of student research assistantships and how those might integrate with partnerships. So Jennifer, I'd like to ask you about this first because I know you had mentioned both classes and some student research assistant projects where both groups were involved or groups were involved separately. And so I wondered what your thinking was about how to match a course. You mentioned online courses, those types of students with the partnership versus or in combination with student assistance, and how you thought about that, the differences between those types of groups of students.
Yeah, I mean, and both come with different challenges too. For class-based projects, you always have the risk that some students won't agree with or want to be a part of that project. For example, in the voter registration project, I had one student who, for religious reasons, that religion didn't support voting as an activity. And so we found a project for her where she wasn't going door to door because that was problematic. But so that, and I think that kind of problem of students not agreeing with the particular project is probably one that's only even more intense in our current polarization today. But so that's a challenge with the class-based projects. I did try in some other courses, different approaches. I teach a grassroots politics class, and in that class, one year I tried to have students identify a community partner that they would individually work with or work with as a small team. And that accommodated students' interests more, but it was very hard to manage and making sure that the quality of the placements and the interactions worked out. So that matching student interests with the project is always a challenge. Overall, the voter mobilization project worked very well. And it allowed for the students to discuss the project with each other because it was an online class. The students also just enjoyed meeting each other in person, as well as working with community volunteers and the organization itself. So that worked well. There are different kinds of experiences. I think the more individualized students serving as research assistants, I had some students doing internships, some students were research assistants, some students were doing directed studies. So they had a variety of sort of levels of engagement with the project, but it ended up being working very well. And the students, when I had some graduate students with undergraduates, added an additional layer of benefit because they were sort of an additional set of mentors in addition to myself and the organizations. And working with the organizations, one of the things that we did, is particularly in the beginning of the project, were having regular meetings, and all the students the meetings were by Zoom. All the students, no matter what their capacity, were part of those meetings. So they got to see the organizations interact with each other, as well as the work that they did outside of those meetings where they worked with specific organizations individually. So it ended up being a really intense experience that did enable students to develop research skills, understand the role of advocacy organizations, the role of coalitions, and was very fruitful for everybody. And the organizations were very happy with the student involvement and enjoyed having them as part of the meetings, and were very appreciative of the work that they put into the project.
Matt, what about your thinking of class experiences and student research assistants?
Unlike Jennifer, I've never taught a project-based class in the way that she's described. The only thing I can think of to maybe add to what Jennifer's already said is that whenever you are working with, say, a research student assistants or a research student team, as opposed to a class, is that whenever you're working with a community partner uh, with student assistants you have to be mindful to make sure that the students understand that, unlike in, say, a classroom setting, that ownership of the project may not just be with us as a research team, but also with the community partner. The best way I can think of to illustrate that is we one time worked with a community partner, and I won't say who, and you'll understand why in a minute, where they wanted to see if this new program that they had implemented was accomplishing its goal. And we assessed the project, and the research team said, well, not only does it not seem to be accomplishing its goal, it seems to be doing the opposite. And the community partner very politely said, thank you for your hard work. We like what you've done. This report is never to see the light of day. So you have to keep in mind that this to make sure that the students know that in a situation like that, um, they have to understand that they got the benefit of the experience, but because of the community partner's decision, they might not be able to do anything more with the actual report or project that they produce. So, unlike in a classroom setting where you might have a bit more control over the deliverable of whatever the students produce. So that's one major difference, I think.
That's an interesting example to bring up in this context. I think it also, the dynamics between classes and class sizes and the number of student assistants, right? If it's a class of 80 or hundreds, Jennifer's approach of working with small groups or individually can work. I'm also fairly cognizant as someone who works primarily in small rural cities of the overburdening that sometimes happens on community partners. So if I send at a previous institution 150 students out into a 10,000 person community every quarter, forever, we will exhaust the animal shelter's capacity to be interested in community partnerships with us very quickly, right? So trying to find a balance, as was mentioned, between the capacity of the students and maybe more capacity in some cases being in a class setting, as Jennifer, you were talking about working all together, being on having that common experience, but in some cases more capacity being just several students as research assistants can more effectively manage the project. That just goes back to what y'all were talking about earlier about aligning with goals of the partnership and the project and making sure not just to take the idea that you have from the partner and kind of slam it into whatever model you think can exist best in that situation, really trying to be intentional about that dynamic of how the students are engaging and how they're receiving credit or how they're being hired or what the learning objectives of the class are. So I think that really tied everything together well in thinking about some of your experiences working with partners. And I want to preview the next panel that is going to discuss some ways that we can think about better being attuned to the needs and perspectives of external partners. We've already started talking about this, but both of our panelists are going to come back for a second follow-up panel and to think about the kind of best practices for working with these partners. So for today, I want to thank both of you for your thoughts and insights. And again, to advertise for everybody else to look for our follow-up panel on some best practices. So thanks very much.